Welcome to the Mob Museum. My name is Jeff Schumacher. I'm the Vice President of Exhibits and Programs here. And just so you know, I can't see anybody. This is like a different kind of deal. I'm very excited about our program tonight because it's going to shed new light on our understanding of the American mob in the 20th century. No doubt, most of you here are well acquainted with the marquee names in our museum. There's Al Capone, Lucky Luciano, Bugsy Siegel, etc. And many of you know a lot more than that. We have a very educated audience here. But as we often discover during our programs, there's always more to learn about the mob story. Although less known than the people I just mentioned, Russell Bufalino was a top echelon figure in 20th century organized crime. We'll learn a lot more about him tonight. And far less known than Bufalino is the man who took over for him, Big Billy D'Elia. By the end of our program, I expect that we will have gained a number of new insights into mob history. But let's start with an introduction of our speaker. Matt Birkbeck is an award-winning investigative journalist and best-selling author. His books include A Beautiful Child and its sequel, Finding Sharon, which were adapted by Netflix for the 2022 film Girl in the Picture. I bet a lot of people here saw that. His other books are Deconstructing Sammy, the story of entertainment legend Sammy Davis Jr., lots of Las Vegas there. A Deadly Secret, which tracked the bizarre story of New York real estate heir Robert Durst. And The Quiet Don, the saga of Russell Bufalino, who was among the most powerful leaders of the Mafia during the latter half of the 20th century. His latest book, published just last month, is Why We're Here Tonight. It's called The Life We Chose, William Big Billy D'Elia and the Last Secrets of America's Most Powerful Mafia Family. Just a note, Matt has also written for People Magazine, Reader's Digest, Playboy, The New York Times, Philadelphia Inquirer, Boston Magazine, and others. So he's very, you can find his articles online and on his website, so if you're interested in looking further. Please welcome Matt Birkbeck. So Matt, I want to start by talking about Russell Bufalino, but even before that, I think we should position the story geographically. Here we are out in the Mountain West, and some of us are from the East, but we don't really maybe understand all the geography. Let's talk about the region of Pennsylvania where all of this started and how the Mafia grew there.
So it goes back to the beginning of the last century. Early 1900s, you have Italian immigrants coming to America, many coming from Sicily. And they go to New York, they'll sail into New York, and many will stay there. And they'll go to Manhattan and Brooklyn and the Bronx and Queens. Others would continue the journey. They would stop in New Jersey. They would go into Pennsylvania. They would stop in places like Pittston, where they had coal mines, and many of them had worked in coal mines in Sicily. And some would even continue on to places like Buffalo and Detroit and Cleveland. So in Pittston, Pennsylvania, there was this very, it became powerful group of immigrants who basically took, what they were members of the mob or the Mafia in Sicily, and they came to Pennsylvania and they began to do what they did over there. And very quickly they took over the unions that were part of the coal mines there. They ran the coal mines and did it for many years. And Russell Bufalino came over in the early 1900s and was part of that. He had an uncle, Charles Bufalino, who was a very, very influential and powerful figure. He was one of the three men. Another one, Santo Volpe, and Stefano Latore. They were the three that really started it in Pittston, Pennsylvania. Pittston's a really cool community. It's off the Susquehanna River, and it's maybe 2 hours west of New York City. And so you had, this community, this Italian community that grew, but it had a huge influence, organized crime influence that grew. And out of that came Russell Bufalino. And that's where his story begins.
Yeah, and we've probably, and anybody who's read books about the mob have heard this name, Russell Bufalino, almost in passing in many cases. So where does he fit into this Mafia narrative of the 20th century?
Russell Bufalino was arguably the most influential one of the most influential and powerful organized crime figures of the 20th century. He was someone who, because he was from Pennsylvania, they kind of paid attention to him, the FBI and the government, but then they didn't. They kind of focused more on the big cities, New York, Chicago, New Orleans, folks in Florida. But Russell, he basically, from the 1940s on, when he took over the family, it started with his introduction to Jimmy Hoffa. He had already been powerful then, but he meets Jimmy Hoffa in the 1940s. Jimmy Hoffa's just starting out, and Russell places his cousin, William Bufalino, who's an attorney, with Hoffa. And William Bufalino becomes ultimately the general counsel of the Teamsters, and Russell becomes very close with Jimmy Hoffa. So he's close with Hoffa. He has great influence within the Teamsters Union. In the 1950s, he had interest in casinos in Cuba. He's a major figure in the 50s. He was one of the organizers of the famous Appalachian meeting in 1957 that basically introduced organized crime, or the Italian Mafia, to the country when state police in New York happened upon this meeting. And Russell then, he went toe-to-toe with Bobby Kennedy during the rackets hearings of the 1950s. And then, in the early 60s, this same Senate committee that was investigating the mob, they knew who Russell was, and they described him as one of the most powerful and violent members of organized crime in the country. But then he became even more powerful in the late 60s and in the 1970s. And at one point in time, he actually controlled 3 families. He controlled his own family. Russell spent a lot of time in New York City, which was...
I was going to ask you, so what's interesting about this is, here he is, essentially in northeastern Pennsylvania, but he has a major influence in New York City. How did that all come to?
He had been in New York City since the 1940s, and he had lived in an apartment and he kept this apartment for many, many years in Midtown. And he also had a restaurant called the Vesuvio. And he split his time between Pennsylvania and between Manhattan. And he just, by the 1970s, he's just this incredibly influential figure where not just organized crime figures are paying heed to him, but you have business leaders, you've got sports figures, you've got entertainers. Entertainers would come visit him. For those of you who have read the book already, there's a scene where anyone that came to play the Copacabana in the early 1970s, they would have to go visit with Russell first and have a lunch with him. And Liberace, there's a scene with Liberace. And he goes and visits with him, and they actually have a nice time. But Russell, by the mid-1970s, he's one of the most powerful figures, organized crime figures in the country.
Just briefly, this Vesuvio restaurant comes up again and again in the story of Bufalino and Billy too. What was it? This was like his gathering place, right? This was kind of where he met people and where everything happened with him.
There were 2 restaurants that he favored. He liked to be at places that he was familiar with. One he owned the Vesuvio, although that wasn't well known. That was in Midtown, and there was another one he would frequent called Johnny D's. And those were his 2 favorites. And of course, for entertainment, he would go to the Copa. But the Vesuvio played a huge role for him in terms of meetings, in terms of everything. Even when he went to eat, he didn't go to too many restaurants. As Billy told me, he'd go to Johnny D's or he'd eat at the Vesuvio. So he was more like a homebody when it came to his own places.
Buffalo, you mentioned it in passing, but Bufalino was targeted by Robert Kennedy. We're talking about, in the early 60s, these attorney general hearings, McClellan hearings, I think. And how did that play out?
So the hearings went on for several years. Jimmy Hoffa testified, other members of organized crime testified. Russell was called to testify. He was subpoenaed, and he pleaded the Fifth. I think he pleaded the Fifth something like 70 times. And he and Bobby Kennedy hated each other. And I can't repeat what was said, but at the end of Russell's testimony, and Russell told this to Billy, at the end of Russell's testimony, Bobby Kennedy rushed up to Russell and said, "Hey, why don't we go have lunch?" And Russell says, "Why would I have lunch with a blank like you?" And when you read the book, you'll know what the blank is. And so, but that carried over for many, many years. It carried on through the situation with the Kennedy brothers in the 60s. And then there's another scene in the book that involves Ted Kennedy, and he carries over to then. So they did not like each other.
So how does it, just to understand a little more about his involvement with New York, his involvement with other places, so how did he interact with the five families in New York?
I asked Billy D'Elia, who we're going to get to in a little bit,
Yep.
but I asked him when I was interviewing. I spent 2 years with Billy interviewing him. I said, "Was Russell ever a member of the commission? The commission that basically ran organized crime." He said, "No, he wasn't a member of the commission." He said, "Russell was above the commission." And I was like, wow. So Russell was the guy that the commission would go to. He was kind of like, sort of like the free agent on the side, this very incredibly powerful figure that they would go and counsel with on major decisions that occurred within organized crime, including decisions on, killing people. And so that was the, basically, in that, 2-minute description that Billy gave me, that was like the breath and the power of Russell Bufalino.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I don't want to go too far because we want to foreshadow a little bit of something we're going to talk about later, but Frank Sheeran was very close with Bufalino, right?
Frank Sheeran.
Frank Sheeran.
Yeah, he was close with close with Russell, and Billy knew him really well. He had met him in the early 70s, and those scenes are in the book, and they're actually pretty funny, some of them. But Frank Sheeran was a very, very dark figure. And he was someone that Russell used strictly for muscle to eliminate people, and the same with Jimmy Hoffa. I know many of you have seen The Irishman, and it was The Irishman that led Billy D'Elia to reach out to me. He had some major issues with it, which we'll get to later, which was Frank Sheeran's story. And the book delves into Frank Sheeran's story in several different ways.
We'll come back to that. We'll take some time with that.
I didn't give it away.
One last thing about Russell, and then we'll move on, is and this is actually another TV show that came out last year, but like Russell played a key role as a mediator between Joe Colombo, the New York Mafia boss, and Al Ruddy, the producer of The Godfather, right?
According to Bill, it was Joe Colombo that was the mediator.
Ah.
And it was Russell who was the one that was pulling the strings. And there's a scene in the book where Russell had a major influence on the making of The Godfather. Not just in the making of it, they had a lot of turbulence, a lot of issues, a lot of violence prior to the production beginning. And it had to do with the Teamsters and whatnot, and what this Italian-American Association wanted in terms of just even approving the movie. They first had issues with it. It was never going to happen. And then they talked about it. And then if you saw the offer, there was some scenes in it that were factual. But Russell was there. And the thing about Billy D'Elia was that he was there. So he's an eyewitness. And, he won me over when he told me he got a phone call one day. They were in Pennsylvania at one of Russell's dress shops. And the phone rings. And Billy picks it up. And a voice says, "It's Marlon Brando calling for Russell Bufalino." And Billy's like, "What?" And he takes the phone and he looks over at Russell and goes, "There's some guy on the phone and says he's Marlon Brando." And Russell goes, "Give me that phone." He goes, "Hello, Marlon, how are you?" They had been talking. Marlon Brando had sought out someone to serve as an inspiration to play Don Corleone. And he was pointed to Russell. And Russell and Marlon Brando met on several occasions, and Russell tutored him on how to be a Don, to the point where the performance, from what I was told, was Russell Bufalino. When you're watching Don Corleone, you're watching Russell Bufalino. And Brando talks about Bufalino. There are a couple of old interviews where he mentions him. But there were other actors that were in the film that were either part of the Bufalino family or tied to the family, like Lenny Montana, who played Luca Brasi. There's a scene in the book where Lenny was a street thug from, I think, Brooklyn or Staten Island. Big guy, he used to be a former wrestler. And he stole a camera from the set, $50,000 camera. And he walks into this restaurant where all these guys are at, and he's showing off this camera he stole, and Russell finds out, and he's screaming at him and says, bring that back. Because Russell had just negotiated the peace, along with Joe Colombo. And then James Caan was basically lived with Russell and Billy and his good friend Andy Russo, who was with the Colombo family. And Andy Russo was very, very close with Russell. So Russell had a great influence in the making of the film, as well as many of the actors that were in the film.
We have this picture up, so we should talk about it. So that's Russell on the far left. What are we looking at here?
I know the three on the left. There are two photos. So that's Russell, that's Andy Russo next to him with his arm over him, and of course that's Frank Sinatra. And Russell knew Frank Sinatra very well, to the point where, Billy met Sinatra in 1972. They went to a restaurant where Sinatra had a bodyguard and close friend named Jilly Rizzo, and this was his place. And they go inside, they go sit at a table, and Jilly comes over to him and says, Russ, this is Frank's table, and he's in town. And Russ goes, I don't care where he is. This is my table. If he wants to eat, he can come sit with me. And Sinatra came in at night, and what did he do? He sat down with Russ Bufalino. And that's the first time Billy had met him, too. And, Billy was, with his family, when he went home and told his aunts and whatnot that he met Frank Sinatra, he was like a star. So I do not know the three fellows on the right. I don't know who they are.
I wonder who stuffed that gun into Frank's belt there.
I'm sorry?
Who stuck the gun in Frank's belt?
That is a toy gun.
Toy gun.
He was making a film, a TV movie. So.
Very good. This is Russell and Billy on the right. So why don't we transition to Billy? So who is Billy D'Elia, and how did he become involved with Bufalino?
Well, Billy D'Elia he was from Pittston, and he was roughly 20 years old, and he was going to business school to become an accountant, and he was in the Army Reserves, and he worked in an appliance store, and he lived in Pittston, and he knew who the gangsters were. And his sister was married to the son of a fellow by the name of Dave Ostico, who was Russell's underboss. And Billy saw Russell at the wedding. Russell showed up at the wedding. Some of you may remember him with a great Yankees player, Joe Pepitone. He was Russell's guest at the wedding. And so Billy had a difficult relationship with his own father. And when you read the book, it's pretty much in the beginning. And I am not going to repeat this scene. It's, if you're an animal lover, you'll hate me. But he had a really tough relationship with his own father. And he's working for this appliance store, and he installs an 8-track tape cartridge in Russell's car. And then he's asked to take the car to Russell at this luncheonette. And he drives the car there, he walks in. Now, Bill's a big guy, he's like 6'5". And Russell was aware of him. And so they talk a little bit, and he goes, you want to come back tomorrow? And Bill goes, sure. And Billy came back the next day, and he was with him for the next 28 years. And he became his so-called son. Russell and his wife didn't have any children. And Bufalino started calling, he started introducing Bill. Bill would drive Russell now. He would become his driver and sort of gopher, and he'd take him into New York into all of his meetings. And Russell would quickly, he started introducing him first as his boy, and then within a year as his son. And now he's Russell's son, and that opened a whole world to Billy. And that was basically the start of his career with Russell.
So he's with Russell, as you said, for a very long time. What events led to Billy essentially taking charge of the family? And in the process, he kind of leaped over some people. right?
He did. So that relationship, it was a pretty. What's really unique about this story, it's intimate. It's unlike most other mob stories that you would hear about. It's at its core, it's a father and son story, and you see that relationship grow. And it took years for Bill to earn Russell's trust. They were like 4 years into it, 3-4 years into it, and Bill had just gotten married, and they were in New York together on Thanksgiving, and Bill got home finally to have dinner with his new wife and their family, and Bufalino calls and says he left his shaver home, go get it and bring it back to New York. And it's like a 2-3 hour drive for Bill, but what does he do? He goes and gets the razor, he goes back to New York, Russell's playing cards with a bunch of guys, he sees Bill walk in, he goes, see, I told you the kid would come. And, that was a test for him. And then Bill, he's made in a very unusual way. He's 6 years in with Russell, and Billy's half Irish, so technically you couldn't be made. But Russell was Russell, and he invited some of the most important organized crime figures in the country to Pittston, Pennsylvania, and Billy is led to a room. He doesn't know what's going on, and he goes over by Russell, and Russell says, you know Bill is my son, and now he's one of us. And that was it. It was like no saints, no burning crosses or anything, none of the, blood coming out of their finger, none of that. Billy now is a made member of the Bufalino family. And so Russell trusted him more than anyone, even more than his own underboss, more than his own consigliere. And it was when Russell was going to prison when he left Billy in charge. Billy was going to be the guy that did business for the Bufalino family.
And how did the other guys react to that?
They weren't happy. They weren't happy at all. There's all these petty jealousies. There's scenes in the book. They tried to set Billy up. Basically, they had this thing. He had this thing that was called the box. And Russell lived in a ranch-style home in Kingston, Pennsylvania. It's very nondescript, but I did all my interviews with him in the home. And it's like a museum today. It's like nothing's really been changed. And he had this thing called the box where he kept all his important papers, money, jewelry, and whoever controlled the box and had the key to the box was the person that was running the family. And Russell announced Billy's going to be the guy. And Dave Estico, the underboss, he wasn't, he had some issues. He had he kind of leaned towards violence every now and then, and Russell knew that he couldn't do it. He had a consigliere, Eddie Scandra, but he was on Long Island, and he didn't really trust him. And Billy was the guy that he trusted. And, there was some turbulence where they tried to set Bill up. Maybe there's money missing, there's jewelry missing, things like that. But Russell's trust in Bill was absolute, and Bill loved him in return just as much.
So just one more piece of that was, Russell's still alive, Russell's still ostensibly in charge. So Billy is going to visit him in prison all the time. He's making these long drives, right?
Well, it was initially, Russell went to prison, so...
There were 2 stints, right?
It was 2 stints, so basically, I'm sure we'll get to this in a little bit with Hoffa, but Russell eventually went to prison, but it wasn't for Hoffa. As Billy tells the story, he was set up by the FBI with this guy by the name of Jack Napoli, who basically wrote a bad check, used Bufalino's name to get some jewelry, and then he goes and sees Bufalino, and Russell's very angry. It's a pretty long scene, and threatens to kill him. But he was just basically saying, you're going to make amends, or I'm going to kill you with my bare hands. That was it. They arrested him, and he went to prison. He went to Danbury, Connecticut, which was only a couple hours away from Pennsylvania. So Bill went there 3 times a week. But what would happen is that Russell would tell him basically what to do, and Bill would travel the country. So Russell was the negotiator. He was the guy that was really settling issues for organized crime, and Bill took his place. And it was through these meetings that he would have in New York, in Philadelphia, in Miami, and then he'd come out west. He'd come out to Las Vegas. He'd go to Los Angeles. He spent a lot of time in LA, in Kansas City, and that's where he would meet people. And he developed his own relationships with these people. And that's where Bill, that's where you begin to see him really grow. You know, the beginning of the book is really more about Bill, the observer. He's the fly on the wall. And then Billy becomes the participant in prison.
And I want to get to his range of activities, Bill. But before we do that, I want to talk briefly about Philadelphia. I mean, it's inevitable, right, that you're in Pennsylvania. You're going to get involved, embroiled, stuck in some kind of Philadelphia deal. And what we're talking about is the Philadelphia mob war. Can you kind of explain where Billy kind of fit into that?
So Bill spent, Russell did 2 stints in prison. The first one, as I said, was in Danbury. The second one was at Leavenworth in Kansas. And Bill had to fly out to Kansas a couple of times a month to go see him. And he maintained business for the Bufalinos in New York, as well as Pittston and everywhere else.
That's him.
That's them in Leavenworth.
Yeah.
But once the government started going after the New York families in the 1980s, you know, right through John Gotti going to prison, early 90s, Bill did not feel comfortable in New York anymore, and he started spending a lot more time in Philadelphia. And then, I guess it was a testament to his ability to befriend people, because there were 2 warring parties in Philadelphia. There's this guy named John Stanfa, another guy named Joey Merlino. John Stanfa's the actual boss, and they're trying to kill each other, and Billy knows both of them, and he's talking to both of them. And he was advising Stanfa on a number of things, including he saved the life of a Philadelphia Inquirer reporter, a very well-known reporter, George Anastasia, who was writing about these mob wars. And John Stanfa, there were headlines almost every day, and Stanfa blamed the press, in particular George Anastasia, and they wanted to throw a bomb into his office, and he would have if Billy didn't stop him. So Billy became involved in Philadelphia. When Stanfa went to prison, he asked Bill if he would take over his family. Billy said no, he didn't want a target on his back. But that was in the 1990s. That was pretty much later on, when Bill was a major figure in Philly.
I want to, you've sort of set the stage real nicely for this section. I want to talk about different things that Billy was involved in over time. But you described him in the book as a mob unicorn. It just said, and what we're talking, I want you to talk about that a little bit, but then he's kind of a fixer, right? His whole thing is fixing problems. And so maybe kind of lead into that.
So basically he took over what Russell was doing, and that was being the so-called negotiator. And so Bill would get the call, you know, but it wasn't just organized crime. That was what was so fascinating about the story. It was sports. It was entertainment. It was people like Donald Trump, who wanted Michael Jackson to play Atlantic City in 1988, and Jackson's manager was a guy by the name of Frank DeLeo, who you may remember from Goodfellas. He played Tootie Cicero, the cab stand owner. And so he said, no, Michael doesn't play casinos. So Trump, not wanting to take no for an answer, enlists 2 mob heavyweights offers them $1 million to convince Frank DeLeo to let Jackson play the casino. So they threaten DeLeo. DeLeo reaches out to friends he has in Pittsburgh, but they're not big enough to handle these other 2 mob guys, one of whom is from Los Angeles. And so they reach out to Bill. And there's this scene at the Helmsley Palace in New York during the Grammys in 1988 where these 2 guys, there's this big meeting, and these 2 guys come in from LA, and they come in and they're yelling, you know, we're taking over Michael's contract and this and that, you're not going to do anything about it. And then they see Bill, and they go, oh no, because they knew Bill. And as a matter of fact, one of them had been on trial with Russell just 6 years earlier. His name was Mike Rizzatelli. And they're begging Billy, please, Trump's going to give us $1 million. Please let us do this. We'll give you half the money. And Billy's upset. He's like, how can you come here and shake, you know, a guy like Frank DeLeo down? Frank knew people. And he basically kicks them out. So that's it. It's not happening. Frank DeLeo's happy. He's thrilled, and he can't thank Bill enough. And Bill turns to him and goes, nope, this isn't over yet. I'm now your partner. And he becomes Michael Jackson's co-manager. And he spends a lot of time that summer, that year. That was the Bad Tour. And here's a photograph. I think this was in Pittsburgh. And Billy was identified publicly as a so-called security consultant. But he spent a lot of time talking to Michael Jackson, and it's in the book, and there were interesting conversations, who he liked about Michael, how he counseled him. He's having issues with his own father, Michael, which Billy could relate to. So it was just, when he told me that story, that was one of those wow moments, when you're doing a project like this. Actually, the first wow moment was when he reached out to me almost 3 years ago and said, hey, you want to talk to Billy DeLee? It was an email. And I was like, huh? And I knew, because I knew who Billy was. But that was there were a lot of wow moments, because a lot of names in this book that you'll find that you're going to go, you're going to go, wow. And, with Trump and Michael Jackson and what happened and Billy becoming his manager, that was interesting.
Why don't we, there's another Donald Trump story, and you don't have to give everything away tonight, but he was on the verge of doing some business with Trump, right?
Yeah, so this to me was really fascinating, because this is in the mid-1990s. Billy had run into Trump over 10, 15 years, and Trump, the businessman, would meet with anyone, including organized crime figures. But now, Russell had died in 1994, and Bill is now the official head of the Bufalino family, and him and Trump are talking about doing deals. They're talking about doing phone cards. They would put a picture of the Taj Mahal casino on a phone card, and they would sell them. Usually, at that time, I think it was mostly immigrants that would buy the cards, for $20 or whatever, so they can call home, wherever that may be. And only Trump wanted too much money up front, so Bill said no. And then they were going to do timeshares, and they were going to invite people to one of his casinos. You spend a few days, but you got to go to a timeshare program for 2 or 3 hours. And you get a gift, and what Trump wanted was he wanted the gifts to be his book, The Art of the Deal. And he wanted Bill to buy 5,000 copies at face value, which would have cost him 6 figures. But what was really genius about it for Trump was that if you buy books in bulk like that at full price, his book's going to go up the bestseller list.
Yeah, right.
And Bill said no, he didn't trust him, and he didn't want to fork over that kind of money up front. And he didn't want his lawyers involved, according to Bill. He didn't want anyone involved. It was just going to be between Bill and Trump, and he'd give him the cash up front. And Bill just didn't do it. But it was the first time. Trump and organized crime, there have always been stories about, having been a builder in New York, you had to deal with the unions, which were run by the mob there, and you had to do business with them. But I think this is the first time I've ever heard of him actually meeting with the head of a crime family.
It's a little bit more of a regional story, but it's no less interesting. Is this developer that wanted to build a casino in Pennsylvania? Can you talk about that?
So there was a local developer, and this is where I had become familiar with Billy when I was a newspaper reporter in the early 2000s, and he was a billionaire with incredible connections, who got his start by being sort of an associate of the Bufalinos. He knew Bill, he knew Russell really well, but he became a billionaire. And he had great political connections. He had senators in his pocket. He had judges, he had the police, law enforcement. And it was just, long story short, Pennsylvania brings casino gambling to the state. Governor Ed Rendell does it. And this guy his name is Louis DeNaples, he wants a casino. He and Bill had known each other for 30 years. And to get the casino, he had to extricate himself from his prior relationship or his current relationship with Billy. And Billy believes he was basically set up. That's why he went to prison in 2006. And Bill believes it's because of this former friend that he was very close with, who eventually did get this gaming license. I ended up writing about it. I wrote like 6 or 7 really deep, big-ticket investigative pieces. It was a corrupt enterprise that didn't just go to the state legislature and the governor. It actually involved the state Supreme Court, because the court was there because they knew that they would get legal challenges to it, and the court was there to basically turn them back. And they did that too. So it was a corrupt enterprise, and Bill ended up going to prison over it.
But it didn't end well for DeNaples either, did it?
Well, sort of, in that Billy testified at a grand jury, before a grand jury after he got arrested. It was the only time he ever did testify. So when Bill got arrested, the government, various agencies, the FBI, Secret Service, Homeland Security, New York City Terrorism Task Force. They all lined up to talk to Billy because they believed he knew a lot, and he did, particularly about Jimmy Hoffa because of his relationship with Bufalino. And Billy wouldn't speak to anyone. He did have to testify before a grand jury over this Naples matter because the government or the state prosecutors in Pennsylvania had video of Billy with the Naples together, or they had audio of them together, or pictures of them together. And if you testify before a grand jury, you can't say, no, I don't know the man, and there you are, having a beer with him or whatever. So he did have to testify against him. The Naples ended up getting the casino. He got charged for perjury for lying that he knew about Bufalino and Billy D'Elia. But the Supreme Court, as I said, which was corrupt and got involved in this, they get involved in this criminal case, which never happens, and they held up this prosecution for over a year to the point where now the prosecutor in the state capitol throws his hands up and says, I can't do anything with this. I can't beat the Supreme Court. So De Naples basically puts the casino in a trust for his family, and his family to this day now runs it.
Amazing. So I can't emphasize enough how the stories that Matt is telling us are much more detailed in the book, and there's a lot of things that are definitely worth digging into. But one of the things that makes this book particularly interesting is Jimmy Hoffa and what you learn about Jimmy Hoffa. But before we get to that very point, kind of talk about, like you mentioned, you referred to this, but like why this book came to pass in the first place. It's because of the way Frank Sheeran claimed he killed Hoffa.
So, as I said earlier, Billy met Frank Sheeran in the early 70s, and he spent a lot of time with him in the 1990s after Sheeran got out of prison in 1994, and Sheeran tells him, I'm going to write a book. And Billy says, fine, you can write a book. Don't write about anyone still alive. Do not mention me in this book, and do not publish this book. Russell had just died, and do not publish this book until Carrie Bufalino, his wife, passes away. And Sheeran says, fine. Sheeran has a writer, kind of a dubious writer. He was from prison, and I think he was in prison for child molestation. And Billy has chapters of this book, the original chapters, and you have to read my book and you'll see what's in it. It's fantastical. But he never claims to have killed Jimmy Hoffa. Other people did it. And there are letters between Sheeran that Billy has, between Sheeran and Hoffa's daughter, Barbara Crancer, in which Billy wants the Hoffa family to participate in the book, and they tell him no. Go tell the FBI what you really know. In any event, so when the book came out in 2004, and it came out 2 years before Carrie Bufalino died, which infuriated Billy, and he claimed to have killed Hoffa, Billy knew that that wasn't the truth. And then years later, which we'll get into in a second, but years later in 2019, he sees The Irishman, and he knew that, there were two things that bothered him. One, the portrayal of Russell Bufalino, not the acting of Joe Pesci. Joe Pesci's great, but it was kind of, Bufalino is seen as, he's not the all-powerful figure that Billy knows him to be, and everyone else knows him to be. He's sort of subservient to other people. So he did not like that, and of course, the story about Frank Sheeran killing Hoffa, according to Billy, it was fiction.
And just to put a point on it, so Sheeran was in prison. Later he learned he was dying, so he wanted to have a best-selling book to have some money for his family, right? But he created, 4 or 5 different versions of what happened before the book I Heard You Paint Houses was published. And he just was kind of looking for the best angle, it seems like, that was going to sell the most copies.
He found another writer by the name of Charles Brandt, who had represented him. He was I think he was an assistant attorney general in Delaware or something like that. And he had represented Sheeran, I think it was in his appeal in the 90s. And Billy met with Brandt because Sheeran, after he fired his first writer, and Sheeran and Billy are really close to the point where Sheeran was calling Billy's house every morning. And Sheeran had a terrible stutter. And it'd be like 6 o'clock in the morning, he'd be calling, waking up Billy's family. You know, is Bill there, you know? And Bill would take Sharon around with him. Sharon was old, and he couldn't really get around, and he really wasn't doing anything. And so Bill would take him around with him in Philadelphia, put him at a bar, let him drink all day, and he'd go pick him up. And so he's writing this book, and it's like, you know, when you read my book, you'll see the different versions of it. But, you know, but then they find this other writer, Charlie Brandt, and he comes up with, and now the book is about Frank Sheeran actually killing Hoffa. And so the reason why Billy had an issue with that is because he was, which I guess is where we're going next, Billy was there in 1975 when Hoffa disappeared. And you want me to get into this?
Well, when you say he was here, the point of this is that, I mean, Billy largely reached out to you because he wanted to tell what he believed to be the accurate story of what happened to Jimmy Hoffa.
He wanted to set the record straight on Russell Bufalino, on Frank Sheeran, as well as he did not want to be seen as someone, I told you he testified against this DeNaples fellow. Billy did not want to be seen. Billy's really old school. I mean, very old school. He's like right out of the 1950s. He really, I mean, he loved this life. He really did, and he has no regrets. But he did not want to be seen as a so-called rat, and he wasn't. But it was really important for him to set the story straight as he saw it. And so that's when they reached out to me in August of 2020, and I got an email, do you want to talk to Billy D'Elia? And I'm like, huh? And, you know, I was telling someone earlier, you know, you got the common sense side of your brain, you got the journalist side of your brain, and the two don't meet. And, you know, the journalist side of my brain is going, yeah, absolutely. And I'm not really thinking about it, because then once I did think about it, I'm like, well, wait a minute, why does he want to talk to me now? Is he mad at me for some reason? I did the quiet Don, I had covered him, you know, is this like something, you know? So, but I did it. I went to go meet him, and then, you know, we talked, and it took a, you know, even though he wanted to tell his story, it took a while to get him to talk. I mean, other than talking about how much he loved Russell Bufalino, to start talking about details, it took like 3 or 4 months. We sat down, I said, Bill, I said, you know, if you really want to tell your story, you got to tell it. Else I got nothing here. And we did. And I think he basically learned to trust me and with his story. And once he did that, that's when things started rolling. We spoke for almost 2 years. And every interview was in the old Bufalino home. And I recorded each and every one of them. So,
you know, we've done, I don't know how many programs have we done on Jimmy Hoffa here, probably 3 or 4 since I've been here. And we've had different panels talking, you know, different experts talking about what happened to Jimmy Hoffa. And we've also talked about where's his body. And this is an ongoing thing. It's a subject of debate every day on social media. And so what's interesting about that is almost everybody who knew what really happened has died. And in fact, a few of them have died within just the last couple of years who might have potentially been able to say something. But Billy learned some things about this from Russell Bufalino, correct?
He learned some things, but he was also at a certain meeting that took place. So just to go back, Bill is introduced to Hoffa in 1972 after he gets out of prison in Florida at a restaurant it was a mob restaurant. It was Joe Sonkin's Gold Coast. And there's a Teamsters convention going on. And when Bill comes in, Bill's told to come down to Florida. And when he goes by Russell, he calls him and says, get down here. So he goes down there, and he's led into a room, and sitting there, Russell's introducing everyone to Bill. And then the last one is a little guy gets up, you know, and Bill's 6'5", and he goes, Jimmy, this is my son, Billy. It was Jimmy Hoffa. That was their first introduction. They see each other again in 1974 at this Frank Sheeran night, some of you might be familiar with, in New Jersey. And there's a lot of pressure because Hoffa wants the union back. I think we're all familiar with it. The story, Hoffa wants the union back. The mob doesn't want to give it back because it came down to the essential states pension funds. Under Hoffa, they had to be paid back, and he collected all the money with interest. Under Frank Fitzsimmons, 37% of the loans were never paid back. And many of the mob guys, many of the leading mob guys, like Tony Provenzano and others, and Provenzano hated Hoffa anyway, but they wanted to keep Frank Fitzsimmons in office. They didn't want Hoffa getting anywhere near that because they thought it would be trouble. And there's a lot of pressure now to eliminate Jimmy Hoffa. The person that's keeping him alive is Russell Bufalino. The two men, as I said, they go back to the 1940s. They love each other. They were in business together. And in 1972, when he got out of prison, Bufalino gives, as a present, gives him the parking contract to the Pocono Downs racetrack in Pennsylvania, northeast Pennsylvania, and it was under the name of Barbara Cranston. They didn't want to put it in Hoffa's name, so they put it in his daughter's name. So he's protecting him. And then it isn't until in June of 1975 where Russell is identified as being a member, as being a recruit of the CIA in these so-called CIA Mafia plots that the US Senate was investigating via the Church Commission, where the CIA had enlisted members of organized crime to either kill Fidel Castro or help them with the Bay of Pigs invasion, with surveillance. And they had heard that Russell, when he fled Cuba, he left behind $1 million that was buried. And that was a true story. Billy confirmed that, because they used to joke with Russell, told him, and they used to joke with Russell from time to time. Hey, Russ, when are we going back for your $1 million? And so Russell, so now that was probably the straw that broke the camel's back. Russell had never been identified. He thought he was going to be subpoenaed. The person the CIA had gone to, the go-between, was Hoffa to get to Russell. And so he thought he and Hoffa were going to be subpoenaed. Sam Giancana had been subpoenaed. Johnny Roselli had been subpoenaed. So immediately after, almost immediately after, it was a week or two after Russell's identified, Sam Giancana's killed. He's murdered. He doesn't testify. Hoffa disappears. And then Johnny Roselli, a year later, ends up dead. But a couple of days after, 2, 3, 4 days after Hoffa disappears, Russell tells Bill, we have to go to New York. We have to drive now. And on the way in to the Vesuvio, Russell tells him that they're going to go meet Tony Provenzano, Tony Salerno, and Frank Sheeran. And the reason for the meeting is that Frank Sheeran is irate and angry over Hoffa's murder and wants to kill Provenzano and Salerno because they were the two that ordered Hoffa's death. And when they get to the restaurant and Sheeran walks in, Bufalino grabs Sheeran's arm, tells him, don't say anything stupid, keep it simple, promise them you won't hurt them, and that will be it. And that's what happened. I said to Bill, now remember, he loved Russell. I mean, I don't think I can explain just how deeply he actually loved them. And I said, would Provenzano and Salerno have ordered Hoffa's murder without Bufalino okaying it, without his approval? And he sat there for a couple of seconds and he said no. So he knew about it. And so basically that now adds more of a confirmation, because I think the FBI had already believed way back when that Provenzano and Salerno were instrumental in Hoffa's disappearance. But this is an eyewitness to it. It also basically takes Sheeran's story and rips it apart about him later on becoming the shooter. So I think the only thing that we don't know now, and I asked Bill this question, and he doesn't know. He doesn't know who the shooter was. He did say, though, the whole Jimmy Hoffa thing, look, I've written 2 mob books. I've covered organized crime in my newspaper days. I don't consider myself a mob writer, right? So I'm not caught up in the minutia of the entire Hoffa thing. It's kind of like a cottage industry now, where Hoffa was buried under Giant Stadium. Last thing we saw, he's buried underneath a parking lot, underneath the New Jersey Turnpike.
Yep.
And Billy scoffed at it. And you're going to kill the most well-known labor leader in the country, and you're going to transport his body several states just to bury it? No. I said, Bill, what happened to him? He said, in his words, he said he was cooked, like within 10 minutes. They had crematoriums. They owned different funeral homes and crematoriums. And and he was gone quickly. So that's the story that Billy D'Elia tells.
Thank you for sharing that. So before we turn it over to questions from the audience, I have two last questions. One is, and this actually came from one of our online viewers, which is, like, what are some things that you had the sense that Billy did not want to talk about? And of course, it's hard to say what those things are.
No, it's pretty easy. Violence.
Violence.
Billy did not want to go back to prison. He does not want to go back to prison. He had 4 really difficult years. And when you read the book, you'll see what happened to him. And it was a painful experience. His family suffered. You know, Bill made a lot of money during his career. He spent it, but he also made it. And his family was living well. When he got arrested, a lot of people turned their backs on him and on his family. They were broke. They had no money. They didn't have much help from people. And so it was a very, very, very difficult time for them. And Bill, there is violence in the book, and you'll see it. I mean, I don't have to spell it out. I don't have to get into, you know, I don't as a writer have to write pages of, you know, with bloody scenes in each and every one of them. As you read the book, you'll know what's violent. I mean, there are some bloody scenes, but you'll read something. You know, Bill talks about, you know, the FBI had gone to Michael Jackson's manager, Frank DeLeo, and they basically were looking into his finances, and they saw he was writing checks to Billy for $100,000, and he's a security consultant, and you know, and so he's making a lot of money as a security consultant. So Frank DeLeo mentions this to Bill, but he's mentioning it as if, yeah, you are getting a lot of money. And Billy walks him up to the top of a parking lot, you know, and points down, and he just says to him, you know, if you fell off of here right now, I would go downstairs, I'd sit on your body, and I'd eat a cheeseburger. So that says what, you know, Billy was or could do or could be when he had to be. But he didn't want to talk about violence to any, you know, to any deep level.
Sure. And my last question would be, so what is Billy doing these days? I think he did an interview or two for the book, but not too much. What's keeping him busy? Is he retired essentially?
Yeah, he's pretty much, you know, he's a grandfather. He lives in Northeast Pennsylvania. He's in the same home he's been in for like 40 years now. You know, he's with his wife. He's got 3 children. They're all professionals. He's got grandchildren. He's got a summer home that he goes to that he's had for many years, and he pretty much leads a pretty quiet life.
One thing I have one more, sorry. One thing I should ask you about too is his wife, who obviously went through all kinds of heck, as you know, during this time, and you got to know her a little bit too.
I'm sorry?
You got to know her.
Yeah, I really liked her a lot. So I grew up in Brooklyn, and where I grew up was a middle-class neighborhood. As a matter of fact, you're not going to believe this, but I met 2 people here tonight who apparently have been out here for 40 years that knew my brothers and sisters and used to come to my house. So it's a very small world. But I grew up in Brooklyn, middle-class neighborhood. My father was a cop. Other neighbors were firemen, you know, all civil service workers, right? But we'd also have our mob guy on the block. It was just like part of this, you know, it was like, you know, it was just part of the fabric of the neighborhood. And we knew them. We hung out with them. My sisters would play with their children. And the families are pretty much out of it. You know, they don't know what's going on. And the husbands are never going to really tell them what's going on. And that was the case with Bill and Ellen. Ellen is a deeply religious woman. She's a sweetheart, is how I describe her. She saw the good, she loved Russell. And she only knew the good in Russell. I mean, she's not involved in any other stuff. She would read about it. It would be a conflict for her, but she would tend to go to the good side. And that's what she wanted to see, the same with his children. So she had it was a difficult marriage, but they are together today. You know, I just saw them the other day together. And, you know, it's, when you read the book, you'll see what she's gone through, and she had to make some sacrifices, but she stuck it out and is still together.
Absolutely. All right, very good. Well, let's open it up to some questions from the audience. Hopefully, if you can raise your hand, we'll have somebody come around with a microphone. We have some hands up here. Here comes Shakayla.
Hi there. When you discussed Billy's relationship with Russell as father-son, would you say that Russell groomed Billy, or it was more of a genuine, I don't know, need from one another to fill that spot?
It's a good question. He groomed him. So I said, this was a really dumb question on my part, right? Early on with Bill. I'm like, he's with Russell. So I'm like, Bill, how are you making money? I said, is he paying you? You get paid every week, every 2 weeks? He just looks at me. He goes, he didn't pay me. He said, he taught me. And I'm thinking about, yeah, he's not going to get a check, He taught him. He taught him how to make money. He taught him how to, different scores, how to fence jewelry, how to do this, how to do, Russell owned all these dress factories. They would get fabric from the manufacturers. They'd make the dresses. They'd have leftover fabric. They would take it. They'd make what would be called overcuts, and they'd sell them, and they'd make a ton of money. Any way they could make money, they did. We just talked about a few examples tonight where, he became Michael Jackson's co-manager. He made a ton of money. I mean, he got involved in other stuff in Philadelphia. He was a rapper named Corrupt, and they ended up, I think you might all know, some of you might know Suge Knight, who he was. Mm-hmm. Billy basically, this is how powerful Billy became. Billy was a really powerful guy. And Billy basically told Suge Knight, you're no longer managing Corrupt, we are. Suge Knight was like, okay. And they took him over, and Billy made millions with Corrupt. So, but Russell did groom him, but, the book is called The Life We Chose, and Billy had a choice. Russell said to him, are you going to be with me? It was like a pivotal scene in the book. They're driving home from New York, and he just turns to him, and he just says, Bill, you're going to be with me. And at first, Billy is not sure what he's talking about, and then he goes, yeah, sure. And he goes, no, are you going to be with me? And then he realizes what he's saying. Are you going to be with me in this life? And Billy says, yeah. And Billy made his choice.
Since Billy got out of prison, how does he earn a living?
I'm sorry?
How does he earn a living now
Today.
that he's out of prison?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I didn't ask him that question. I mean, Bill, are you getting a Social Security check? Bill, did you hide, millions somewhere? I mean, he doesn't, he's not living a flamboyant life. He still, still has the rings. He still wears the jewelry. Like I said, he's old school. He's, and I will tell you this, in the almost 3 years that I've known him, I didn't catch him once telling me something that wasn't true. We talked about, old athletes, Johnny Unitas, meeting with Bufalino and Billy years ago. Okay. And then a reporter friend of mine from Washington calls me and says, because he knew I was doing the book, and he says, you want to meet me? I'm going to come up. You want to meet me? I said, sure. We go have lunch. He pulls out FBI files with Bufalino meeting with Johnny Unitas. And Billy was there. And the FBI guys are floored. To answer the question again, I can't answer it. I don't know.
But he had a hard time while he was in prison. If they had no money, nobody supported them. He comes out of prison.
Well, she was his wife. His wife was a trauma nurse early on. She had worked. I'm sure. It's not one of those questions I would say, Bill. He's retired. He's in his 70s right now. He's not doing anything. I mean, he spent a lot of time with me over the course of 2 years. So he's not really, I didn't find that he was like, when he came out of prison, he had to work in an ice cream shop as part of his parole. I mean, he had to do that, but he wasn't living on that.
We got a question in the middle.
Two questions.
Yep.
Who's the people in this photograph?
Oh, yeah.
And number one. Number two question would be, Russell seems so smooth and smooth operator. How did he get put in jail? That kind of baffles me. I don't know anything about it, but it seems like he was too smooth to be put in jail with the scale he was in.
I'm sorry, the question was?
How is, he was such a smooth operator, how did he end up in prison?
He put himself in prison. So basically, what the government did, so I told you the Hoffa story, and Russell Bufalino was among the original suspects in Hoffa's disappearance. And the FBI did not arrest anyone. They had a list of suspects. They tried their best. They had like a 500-person task force. They had grand juries. They did this. They did that. They could not arrest. So what they did, which is what the government will do, they'll get you on something else. And in this case, they got him threatening this guy, Jack Napoli, who used Russell's name to get jewelry by using a bounced check. And then when he came in, it was a setup, according to Billy. And when Russell called this guy in to the Vesuvio and said to him, he was actually nice to him, according to Bill. He was like, look, what are you doing? Go get yourself, go work out a payment plan, pay back the money you ripped off, and get yourself together. And the guy's like, yeah, okay, and he leaves. He comes back a half hour later. Now, he's wired, too. And he comes in, and the first thing he does is he insults Russell. And he did it on purpose, according to Bill. And you don't do that to Russell. And Russell was furious, and what he said out of anger, now I'm not defending it, I'm just repeating it, was, I will kill you with my bare hands if you don't make this right. Well, that, I'll kill you with my bare hands, got him in prison. And Russell's defense was, I was just saying it out of anger. But what happened, he went to prison the second time, is because he actually, the guy that wanted to become Michael Jackson's, who was working for Trump and came in and was threatening to get Michael Jackson to play in the casino, Bufalino, his name was Mike Rizzatelli, Bufalino, through another person, got him to try to find Jack Napoli and kill him. And that's what got Russell in prison the second time. So yeah, he was a smooth operator, but he let his emotions. He actually felt he was justified in threatening him, and he didn't think he had to go to prison for it the first time. I'm sorry?
Oh, the photograph.
Oh, that's Frank Sheeran on the left. That's Russell. They were in prison together at the medical facility in Missouri. This was like 1988, 89, and they were there together, along with Tony Salerno. Tony Salerno died. And I don't know who the guy, he's probably a staffer there, a guy in a white.
So there's one, let's take one more question. Then we can, if you have other questions, we can ask them during the book signing. Go ahead.
So in all your interactions with these guys, what do they tell you about their involvement in the Trump casino in Atlantic City specifically?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
What do they have to say about their involvement in the Trump casino in Atlantic City?
Oh, when you read the book, you'll see Billy had a huge business in Atlantic City. Not necessarily involving Trump, but Billy is dealing with, I don't want to give too much away, the owner of the Philadelphia Eagles was a degenerate gambler. And Billy would basically lend him money, a lot of money. Like in one time it was like $400,000. He was a Shylock, Bill. And he needed money, gave him $400,000. The guy gambled it away within a half an hour.
That never happens in Las Vegas.
His name was Leonard Toes. But he was a good gambler because when he went to pay Billy back, he brought him a bottle of champagne too. So there were other people there that Billy was a big figure in Atlantic City. Billy ended up getting banned from Atlantic City in 2003. The government claimed he was involved in this money laundering operation, and they would transport gambling proceeds from Pennsylvania to Atlantic City, and they'd have people bring bags of cash, and they'd convert them into chips. I mean, the scam.
One thing to know about Atlantic City is, like in Nevada, we have the Black Book, right, which has maybe 24 names in it. In Atlantic City, it's hundreds of names. So they're much more aggressive in that sense.
And they put Billy's name in it. Billy said that whole story of the money laundering thing. It wasn't what the government said it was. But the whole, the Trump, there's different scenes with Trump in the book, including this, I'm not going to get into this story you read in the book, this infamous coin toss over $1 million. But there were several interactions with Trump. as well as with a number of other people, including some very well-known sports figures.
Yeah. Well, very good. Why don't we leave it there? Please join me in thanking Matt for a great program. And in a minute, he's gonna head out to the waiting room outside the courtroom, and there are books for sale. He'll sign them. He'll talk to you. It should be a good time. Thank you.